The Outsider by H.P. Lovecraft, written in 1921. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon the long hours and vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon odd watches and twilight grooves of grotesque, gigantic and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods give to me, the dazed and disappointed, the barren, the broken. And yet I am strangely content, and cling desperately to those seer memories, and when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond, to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages, and having high ceilings where the eye could only find cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of all the piled up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used to sometimes light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined, and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle itself. To me there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strewed some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the coloured pictures of living beings which I found in many of the mouldy books. From such books I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all these years, not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try and speak it aloud. My aspect was a matter of equally unthought of, and if there was no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to the useful figures that I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt consciousness of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat and under the dark mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst the gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went further from the castle the shade grew denser and the air filled with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back lest I lose my way in the labyrinth of nighted silence. So through endless twilights I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then, in the shadowy silhouette of my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted, entering my hands to the single black ruined tower that reached above the forest, into the unknown outer sky. And at last, I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since I were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding the day. In the dank twilight I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to the small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stirless cylinder of rock, black, ruined and deserted, and sinister with startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress, for climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and the new chill as if a haunted and vulnerable mould assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light and would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly groped with one free hand for a window embrasure, and I might peer out and above and try to judge the height that I had attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up the concave of desperate precipice, I felt my hand touch a solid thing, and I knew that I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, till finally my testing hand had found the barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and my hands went higher. I knew that my climb was for nonce ended, since the slab was a trap door for the aperture leading to the level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower. No doubt the floor of some lofty and capacious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully and tried to prevent heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the later attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, and hoped when necessary to pry it open again. Believing I was now at a prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself from the floor and fumbled about for the windows, that I might look for the first time upon the sky, and the moon, and the stars of which I had read. But in every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble, bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected, and wondered what horsory secrets might abide in this high apartment so many aeons cut off from the castle below. Then, unexpectedly, my hands came upon a doorway, where hung a long portal of stone, rough with strange chiselling. Trying it, I found it locked. With a supreme burst of strength, I overcame all obstacles and dragged it open inward. As I did, so there came to me the purest ecstasy that I have ever known, for shining tranquilly through an ornate grating of iron and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen save in dreams and vague visions I dare not call memories. Fancying now that I had attained the very principle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door. But the sudden veiling of the moon by cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height of which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most demoniacal of all the shocks of the abysmal, unexpected, and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone could compare in terror which I now saw, with the bizarre marvels in the sight implied. The sight itself was simple, as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from the lofty eminence, there stretched around me a level, though the grating nothing less than a solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still had the frantic craving for the light, and had not even a fantastic wonder which had happened could say my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but was determined to gaze upon the brilliant and gaiety at any costs. I knew not who I was, or what I was, or what my surroundings might be. Though I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch and out of the region of slabs and columns, and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows where the only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbling, mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable, ivied castle of thickly wooded park, maddeningly familiar, and yet some of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings extended to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze, with light sending forth the sound of the guest revelry. Advancing to one of those, I looked in and saw the oddly dressed company indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I had never seemingly heard human speech before, and I could guess only vaguely what it said. Some of the faces seemed to behold expressions and brought up increasingly remote recollections. Others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window and into the brilliantly lighted room, stepping as I did so from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered, there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I have ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon a whole company a sudden of unhaltered fear and hideous intensity, distorting every face and evoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal. In the clamour and panic, several fell in the swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly to the race of their escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against walls before they mangled to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me, unseen. The casual inspection of the room seemed deserted, but when I moved towards one of the alcoves, I thought I detected the presence there, a hint of motion beyond the golden arched doorway, leading to another and somewhat familiar room. As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly, and then, with first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me as almost as poignantly as its nauseous cause, I beheld in full frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable and unmentionable monstrosity which had by its simple appearance changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was compounded of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity and desolation, the putrid, dripping eidolon of the unwholesome revelation, the awful burn of which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows, it was not of this world, or no longer of this world, yet to my horror I saw in its eaten away and bone-revealing outlines and leering a abhorrent travesty on the human shape and its mouldy, disintegrating appeal and unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralysed, but not too much so to make feeble effort towards flight. A backward stumble which failed me to break the spell of which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitching by the glassed orbs which stared lonesomely into them, refused to close, though they were mercifully blurred, and showed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance so that I could stagger forward several steps to avoid falling, and as I did I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off the foetid apparition which pressed so close. When in one cataclysmic second of a cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accident, my fingers touched the rotten, outstretched paws of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second what it had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle in the trees, and recognised the altered edifice of which I now stood. I recognised, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my solid fingers from its own. But in the cosmos there is balm as well as bitterness, and that balm is nepathy. In the supreme horror of that second I forgot what had horrified me, and the burst of black memory vanished in the chaos of echoing images. In a dream I had fled from the haunted and accursed pile and ran swiftly and silently into the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of the marble and went down the steps, I found the stone trap door immovable. But I was not sorry, for I had hated the antique castle in the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls in the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of the Nephrin Ka and the sealed and unknown valley of Hadoth in the Nile. I know the light is not for me, save that for the moon over the rock tombs of Nib, nor any gaiety of the save the unnamed feasts of Nacrus beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet in my new wildness and freedom I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For although nepathy has calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century and among those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within the great gilded frame, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold, unyielding surface of polished glass.